Hey Film Buffs, welcome back to Film Feature 43. Today we're going to do another 43 Facts video. This one is a viewer requested video. We're going the whole way back to 1917 by talking about the 2020 film 1917. So without further ado, let's get into talking about the facts. The movie 1917 was director Sam Mendes' first writing credit, and the story of Lance Corporal William Schofield was based partially on Mendes' grandfather and the book The Autobiography of Alfred H. Mendes. Lance Corporal Mendes entered World War I at the age of 17 and was tasked with taking a message across no man's land. He was only about 5 foot 4 inches tall, so he was able to more easily hide among the 6 foot of mist that was along the ground during much of his mission, and he picked up a habit of frequently washing his hands due to how gross the trenches were during World War I. Before production began, 5,200 feet, or about 1.6 kilometers, of trenches had to be dug for the movie, and that made conservationists a little bit nervous because they were afraid that the remains in the Salisbury Plains where the movie was shot were going to be disturbed, so a survey was taken before production could ever even start filming. And also before start filming, because of the way that this movie was shot to look like 2 big long takes, they had to rehearse for 6 months before any film ran through any cameras. Even though the movie looks like it's 2 big long takes, there are dozens of cuts throughout. The longest take in this movie was about 8.5 minutes long. And trying to get these one-take shots is an extremely difficult task, where a scene that would normally take 1 or 2 takes to get correctly, they had to film it 20 to 50 times because of how much they needed things to line up as they were piecing it together. To try to keep shot continuity and to better hide where the edits were, a 40mm lens was used on the camera for the majority of shots in this film to stop the focal lengths from changing. Adding to the illusion of the one take, in the scene where Lance Corporal Schofield is running along the trench, we see him run into multiple soldiers. Those run-ins were accidental and were not in the script, but the rule on set was you keep going until Mendes yelled cut. Mendes never yelled cut, so George Mackay kept running, and it became one of the most memorable scenes in the movie. In 1917, you can also see 3 soldiers running into battle without any weapons during the trench run scene. Those 3 soldiers were actually part of the camera crew. They were not extras. They dressed like soldiers to better hide themselves while they were moving camera equipment. Another thing that added to the effect of this movie being 2 big long takes is the camera work. During the scene where 2 German soldiers are chasing after Schofield and he jumps into the river, a motorcycle was actually used by the camera crew to get better fluidity in that shot. The German soldiers that we see during this scene are actually named Balmer and Muller, which are the names of the German soldiers in the 1929 book All Quiet on the Western Front, which is kind of a mere opposite of this movie, focusing on the struggles of German soldiers during World War I. The lighting rig used during the scene with the burning church and the abandoned city was 5 stories tall and had 2,000 tungsten lights, making it the biggest lighting rig to be used in film at the time of the movie's release. And the flares that light most of that scene were on a wire so the movements could be controlled, and they were designed to burn brighter the closer they got to the tungsten lights of the lighting rig. And in the scene where Schofield is running through the abandoned city, where most of the lighting is provided by the flares, we see him stop in front of a fire hydrant, and there's a circus poster behind him on the wall. That circus poster is actually a reference to Mendes' grandmother, who grew up in the same circus in South America in the 1920s and 1930s. Speaking of Mendes' family, the scene with the French citizen and the orphan baby was written into the movie because Mendes was a new father and started thinking about his daughter in this situation and her being alone, and that moved him to write the scene into the movie. It's also partially based on the account of Sergeant Richard Tobin from 1914, who gave a bottle of water to a woman with a baby. And the end of Tobin's account ends with the British government may have lost a bottle of water, but a baby found a meal. In the movie 1917 as a whole, Mendes did a good job writing in scenes that reference the reality of how bad World War I actually was. Like, we hear soldiers being warned to stay away from the craters because they're deeper than they look. In actuality, during World War I, a lot of soldiers got stuck in craters being made by the mortars because of how thick the mud was, and they either died from exposure, exhaustion, or being shot by the enemy. We also hear Blake mention that he thought he would be home by Christmas, and that's a reference to the fact that a lot of people thought that the war would be over by Christmas in 1914, and British and German soldiers even played soccer and sang Christmas carols and exchanged gifts, but by 1915 it was clear that the war wasn't going to end, so all the festivities in 1915 ended, and they just kept fighting. Sleep in and you may have noticed that in the movie, the German trenches appear to be better made and more comfortable than the British trenches, and that's a reference to the fact that the Germans thought that the war was going to go on much longer than what the British did, so they actually added some comfort to their trenches where the British thought it'd be over quickly, so they just slapped them together. And the German retreat and booby-trapping of the trenches that we see in the film is based on Operation Alberich, which really took place. And towards the end of the film, we see a captain crying, which is supposed to symbolize the PTSD that a lot of soldiers suffered from after World War I. Between August of 1914 and March of 1920, 346 British and Commonwealth soldiers were executed for cowardice and other offenses. In 2007, 306 of those were pardoned. Of the other 40, 37 were executed for murder and 3 for mutiny, so I guess that makes up for it. Both of the main characters that we follow throughout the film were Lance Corporals, and in World War I, a corporal had a higher death rate than almost anybody else because they marched in front of their men into battle. So a lot of the soldiers that were elevated to corporal during base camp would take off their stripes on the way over to Europe because of how high the death rate was. One more real-world fact, the beginning of the movie 1917 takes place on April 6, 1917, which is the day the United States entered World War I, but you don't hear that throughout the movie, and that makes sense because the soldiers in the north of France would not have heard of the United States entering the war until much later. And because the filmmakers were so dead set on getting the movie to look like one big long take, the hardest scene for them to film is when you meet Lieutenant Leslie. When he lights a cigarette, the lighter would not work on cue, so it took many takes to get that scene correct, wasting an entire day of filming. Another struggle the filmmakers had for this movie was the constantly changing weather.
We have to shoot in cloud to get the continuity from scene to scene.
So they had a chief meteorologist on set at all times and 4 different rigging systems that could be interchanged with however the weather was feeling that day.
And then we'd be waiting around, everyone with their eyes up in the sky, trying to see how long it'd take for the sun to move behind the cloud.
And as soon as it comes over, you've got this 5-minute window.
Everyone would be like, come on, go, go, go.
Go, go, go!
One scene that was easier to shoot and was done in one take is where Schofield meets Lieutenant Blake and gives him his brother's ring and then goes sits underneath a tree. In an interview, an extra has said that the tree that Schofield sits under was actually used as a toilet by over 100 of the extras because the actual bathroom was so far away and they didn't know that that tree was going to be used in the final scene. And during the scene with a French woman, she asks Schofield if he has any children, to which he doesn't answer, but whenever he's sitting under the pea tree, we see from the picture that he's holding that he actually has 2 daughters. And did you ever notice that when we meet Schofield and when we leave him, it's actually bookend by him sitting underneath a tree? In the same way with Corporal Blake, he's laying down facing the sky with his eyes closed. And one more thing about the Lieutenant Blake scene, have you ever noticed that we don't really know the main characters' names until Schofield meets Lieutenant Blake at the end of the movie?
No, my brother. I was sent here with him. Tom's here. Where is he?
A few miscellaneous facts about 1917 to wrap up the video. The big name cameos like Benedict Cumberbatch and Mark Strong and Colin Firth were all secured by Sam Mendes because he promised them that they wouldn't have to do any press for the movie. And Tom Holland was in talks to play Lance Corporal Blake, but had to drop out because of scheduling conflicts. Some of the movie was shot in public parks, so signs had to be put up everywhere, warning people that there were dead bodies, so no one would freak out. And it was said that George Mackay was such a nice guy that he shook everybody's hand at the end of each day of filming and knew everyone on set's name by the end of the movie. And the maggots that we see crawling on some of the dead people weren't really there. The film production crew went out the day before and picked up maggots from a local bait shop and then filmed them on a blue screen and then composited them into the dead bodies' faces. Cinematographer Roger Deakins won over 40 awards for the filming of 1917, and whatever you think of the film, you have to admit that it's beautiful. 1917 is the first war movie to win an Academy Award for Best Visual Effects since Tora Tora Tora, and it was nominated for 10 different Academy Awards and only brought home 3. That's all the facts I have for the movie 1917. If you have a suggestion on what movies you want to hear facts about, leave them down in the comments. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.